The year is 1947. The world has just emerged from the most devastating conflict in human history. But the silence that follows is not peace. It is the held breath before a storm. In the rubble of Berlin, in the corridors of Washington, in the shadowed alleys of Moscow, a new kind of war is being born. This war has no front lines, no declarations, no cavalry charges at dawn. It is fought in whispers and codes, in hotel rooms and dead drops, in the minds of men who will never fire a shot, but who hold the fate of nations in their hands. Two intelligence agencies rise from the ashes of World War II, each convinced that the survival of civilization itself depends on the destruction of the other. The Central Intelligence Agency and the Komitet Gosударственной Безопасности, the CIA and the KGB. For nearly 5 decades, these two organizations will wage an invisible war that shapes every conflict, every coup, every revolution on Earth. This is not a story of heroes and villains. This is a story of mirrors facing mirrors, where every move is countered. Every truth is wrapped in lies, and trust itself becomes a weapon. The world that gives birth to these agencies is fractured and terrified. The alliance that defeated Hitler shatters before the victory parades have ended. The Soviet Union, having bled 27 million of its people to stop the Nazi machine, looks westward and sees not grateful allies but potential enemies, capitalist powers who have always despised communism, who funded the White Army during the Russian Civil War, who watched the Nazis march east with barely concealed satisfaction. The United States, emerging from the war as the only major power, with its infrastructure intact, looks eastward and sees totalitarianism spreading. Like a virus, communist parties gaining ground in France and Italy's Soviet troops occupying Eastern Europe, a system that denies everything America believes it stands for. Neither side can afford to blink. Neither side can afford to trust. And so they build institutions designed for a simple purpose: to know everything about the enemy, while revealing nothing about themselves. The KGB evolves from a brutal lineage. Its roots stretch back to the Cheka, Lenin's instrument of revolutionary terror, through the NKVD that orchestrated Stalin's purges, to the MGB that emerged in the war's final years. By 1954, these scattered organs of state security consolidate into the KGB, an organization that is simultaneously intelligence service, secret police, border guard, and ideological enforcer. The KGB does not merely spy on foreign enemies, it monitors Soviet citizens, suppresses dissent, guards the purity of communist thought. Its officers are selected for ideological reliability as much as competence. They are taught that the capitalist world is a predator circling the socialist motherland, that Western intelligence services are ceaselessly plotting its destruction. That vigilance is not paranoia, but survival. The KGB sees itself as the shield and sword of the revolution, the guardian of a historical inevitability that Western powers are desperately trying to prevent. Every defector is a traitor to humanity's future. Every Western spy is an agent of reaction and exploitation. The stakes, in their view, could not be higher. The CIA, by contrast, is born from improvisation and anxiety. America had no permanent intelligence service before World War II, considering such institutions vaguely un-American, tainted by the authoritarianism of European monarchies. The Office of Strategic Services, cobbled together during the war, proves the value of coordinated intelligence, but it is disbanded as soon as the fighting stops. Then reality intrudes. Soviet codes are broken, revealing espionage networks operating inside the American government. Communist forces are advancing in China. Stalin is tightening his grip on Eastern Europe. In 1947, President Truman signs the National Security Act, creating the CIA from the skeleton of the OSS and the scattered intelligence offices of the military. The new agency is given a mandate, both vague and vast, to collect intelligence, conduct covert operations, and counter the Soviet threat by any means necessary. Unlike the KGB, the CIA does not police its own citizens. The FBI handles domestic counterintelligence. But in every other respect, the The two agencies become dark reflections of each other, each convinced that the other represents an existential threat that must be met with matching ruthlessness. What makes the Cold War uniquely psychological is that neither side can afford open confrontation. Both possess nuclear weapons. Both understand that total war means total annihilation. The battlefield shifts to the shadows, and intelligence becomes the primary weapon. Information is power. But in this conflict, misinformation is equally valuable. Both agencies master the art of deception, feeding false intelligence to the enemy, planting fabricated documents, turning captured agents into unwitting channels of disinformation. Every piece of intelligence must be verified against the assumption that it might be a lie, designed to trigger a desired response. Trust becomes impossible. Even within each agency, paranoia metastasizes. The CIA launches counterintelligence operations convinced that moles have infiltrated its ranks. The KGB conducts internal purges, destroying careers on whispered suspicions. Officers on both sides learn to read faces for micro-expressions of doubt, to weigh every word from a colleague for hidden meaning. The agencies do not merely fight each other, they consume themselves, growing ever more secretive, ever more isolated, ever more convinced that everyone is a potential threat. Recruitment becomes an art form practiced with surgical precision. The KGB favors ideological converts, seeking out Westerners disillusioned with capitalism, intellectuals attracted to Marxist theory, trade unionists angry at exploitation, students swept up in revolutionary fervor. They offer these recruits not just money but meaning, a chance to serve history, to be part of humanity's march toward justice. The recruitment is slow, patient, often taking years to cultivate a source, to test their commitment, to bind them with small compromises until they are too deep to withdraw. The CIA takes a more pragmatic approach, recruiting from a different kind of disillusionment. Soviet officials frustrated by the bureaucracy, Eastern European refugees who have lost everything to communism, intelligence officers whose loyalty is corroded by cynicism or greed. They offer escape, wealth, new identities, the promise that the West will win because freedom and prosperity are more powerful than ideology. Both agencies become expert at finding the crack in a person's armor, the moment of vulnerability, the need that can be exploited. They do not force anyone to betray their country. They simply make betrayal feel like the only rational choice. The intelligence philosophies that emerge are shaped by their origins. The KGB operates with centralized control, everything flowing through Moscow's center. Every operation approved by the Politburo. Information is compartmentalized ruthlessly. Officers know only what they need to know, and nothing more. This creates security, but also rigidity, an inability to adapt quickly when circumstances change. The CIA, born from American pragmatism and the OSS's wartime improvisations, gives its officers more operational freedom, encourages creative problem solving, values results over rigid adherence to procedure. This creates flexibility, but also chaos, operations that spin out of control, officers who go rogue, disasters that are covered up rather than learned from. Each system has its strengths, each has fatal weaknesses that the other will learn to exploit. Both agencies come to view the world not as a collection of nations pursuing their own interests, but as a chessboard where every piece must be moved in service of the great game. Civil wars in Latin America, independence movements in Africa, political parties in Western Europe, all are potential assets or threats to be supported or subverted based solely on their alignment with Washington or Moscow. The human cost of these calculations is considered acceptable. Governments can be toppled if they lean toward the wrong ideology. Elections can be fixed if they might produce the wrong result. Populations can be deceived if the truth would undermine strategic interests. Neither the CIA nor the KGB invented this ruthlessness. Intelligence services have always operated in moral twilight, but the Cold War elevates it to a principle of statecraft, a necessity justified by the belief that the enemy is doing exactly the same thing. And they are. As the 1950s dawn, both agencies are expanding, recruiting, building networks that span the globe. The invisible war is just beginning, and already both sides understand that there will be no clean victory, no peace treaty, no end except exhaustion or apocalypse. They are locked in an embrace that neither can break, destined to fight in the shadows while the world above lives in the fragile peace their silent struggle maintains. The first moves have been made. The pieces are in position. And somewhere, in Moscow or Washington or Berlin, someone is planning the next operation, the next deception, the next betrayal that will shift the balance by the smallest fraction. Because in this war, the smallest fraction might be everything. The operations begin almost immediately, and Europe becomes the proving ground. The continent is still bleeding from the war, its cities shattered, its economies in ruins, its populations desperate for stability and hope. Into this vulnerability, both the CIA and KGB pour resources with the understanding that whoever controls Europe controls the future. The Marshall Plan flows westward, billions of dollars rebuilding infrastructure, but woven through the reconstruction money or CIA funds financing anti-communist parties, supporting labor unions that will reject Soviet influence, establishing newspapers and radio stations that will broadcast the American vision of freedom. In the East, the KGB orchestrates a different reconstruction, ensuring that Communist parties seize control of governments, that opposition voices are silenced, that Soviet-friendly regimes take root in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania. The citizens caught between these pressures rarely understand that their political choices are being shaped by invisible hands, that the parties they vote for are funded by foreign intelligence, that the newspapers they read are propaganda tools disguised as independent journalism. Democracy becomes theater, and the script is written in Washington and Moscow. Berlin is the focal point, the place where the invisible war becomes almost visible. The city is carved into four zones after Germany's defeat, but by 1948, the Western sectors and the Soviet sector might as well be different planets. The Soviets blockade West Berlin, trying to starve it into submission. The Americans respond with an airlift, flying in supplies for months, a logistical miracle that is also an intelligence goldmine. Every flight is monitored, every pilot debriefed, every observation of Soviet military movements cataloged. When the blockade fails and Berlin officially splits into two cities in 1949, the result is a frontier town unlike any other, a place where East meets West across checkpoints and barbed wire, where spies from both sides operate openly because everyone knows they are there but proving it is another matter. The KGB establishes its networks in East Berlin, recruiting informants among the population, watching for signs of defection or dissent. The CIA sets up stations in West Berlin, running operations into the East, offering escape routes to scientists and military officers, collecting intelligence on Soviet capabilities. The city becomes a hall of mirrors where everyone is watching everyone else, where a casual conversation in a cafe might be a recruitment pitch or a trap, where trust is a luxury no one can afford. Double agents emerge as the most valuable and most dangerous pieces on the board, to turn an enemy officer, to convince them to betray their country while continuing to work within its intelligence service. Is the ultimate victory? It provides not just information, but the ability to feed false intelligence back through the enemy's own systems to shape their understanding of reality itself. The KGB scores early successes, penetrating British intelligence so thoroughly that classified information flows to Moscow almost as soon as it reaches London. Kim Philby, a senior British officer liaising with the CIA, is a Soviet agent for years, betraying operations, exposing Western spies in Eastern Europe, sending dozens to their deaths. When he is finally suspected and defects to Moscow in 1963, the revelation devastates Western intelligence. How many other Philbys are there? How much of what we know is contaminated by Soviet manipulation? The CIA launches mole hunts that consume careers and poison relationships. Officers who have served for decades find themselves under suspicion because they knew Philby, because their operations failed, because someone whispered a doubt, Paranoia becomes policy. The CIA has its own successes, though they are discovered only slowly by the Soviets. Colonel Oleg Penkovsky, a Soviet military intelligence officer, provides the West with critical information about Soviet missile capabilities, intelligence that proves invaluable during the Cuban Missile Crisis. But he is caught and executed, and the KGB launches its own internal purges, convinced that if one officer could betray them, others must be hidden in their ranks. The hunt for moles becomes self-destructive on both sides. Innocent officers are destroyed by suspicion. Genuine double agents continue operating because the counterintelligence officers are chasing ghosts. The agencies begin to devour themselves, expending enormous resources not on gathering intelligence, but on verifying the loyalty of their own people. What happens to an organization when it can trust no one, not even itself? Sleeper agents and deep cover operatives represent a different kind of patience, a willingness to play a game that might last decades. The KGB embeds officers in Western countries with false identities, people who live ordinary lives, who work ordinary jobs, who marry and raise children and wait for activation orders that may never come. They are insurance policies, resources to be used only in moments of extreme need. The strain of living a double life, of maintaining a false identity year after year, of lying to everyone, including spouses and children, is immense. Some break under the pressure. Some defect, unable to sustain the deception. Some are never activated, living their entire lives in a foreign country, growing old without ever serving the purpose for which they were trained. The CIA attempts similar programs, inserting officers into Eastern Bloc countries, though the closed nature of Soviet society makes this far more difficult. The officers who volunteer for these assignments are a particular breed, capable of enduring isolation, of suppressing their true selves for years, of accepting that they might die without anyone ever knowing what they sacrificed. Intelligence work, at this level, is not adventure. It is psychological endurance, a slow erosion of identity and certainty. Elections across Europe and beyond become targets for manipulation. The CIA pours money into Italian elections in 1948, ensuring that the Christian Democrats defeat the Communists. The operation is considered a success, proof that covert action can shape political outcomes without military intervention. The KGB funds communist parties across Western Europe, supports strikes and protests, amplifies any social tension that might weaken capitalist governments. In countries emerging from colonialism, both agencies see opportunities. Nationalist movements in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are courted, armed, and betrayed based on calculations made thousands of miles away. Leaders who show promise are cultivated with aid and weapons. Leaders who align with the wrong side are targeted for removal. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, Mohamed Mossadegh in Iran, Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala, these men, and dozens of others find themselves caught in the machinery of the Cold War. Their governments toppled, not by popular will, but by covert operations designed to serve superpower interests. The populations of these countries rarely understand why their leaders are suddenly gone, why their governments collapse, why outside powers seem to control their destinies. The invisible hand of intelligence shapes their lives without explanation or accountability. Propaganda and disinformation become sciences in their own right. The CIA establishes Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, broadcasting into Eastern Bloc countries, offering news the Soviets suppress, emphasizing Western prosperity and freedom. The content is carefully crafted, not crude propaganda, but a mixture of truth, omission, and strategic emphasis designed to erode faith in communist systems. The KGB operates its own machinery, spreading stories about American racism, poverty, imperialism, using genuine social problems in the West as ammunition. Both sides plant false stories in foreign newspapers, fabricate documents to discredit enemies, create scandals to weaken opposing governments. The line between truth and manipulation becomes increasingly unclear. How do you trust any information when you know that intelligence agencies on both sides are actively shaping the narrative? Journalists become unwitting tools or willing collaborators. Academic conferences are monitored for recruitment opportunities. Cultural exchanges are intelligence operations disguised as diplomacy. Nothing is neutral. Nothing is what it appears to be. The officers carrying out these operations pay a price that is rarely acknowledged. The work is exhausting, requiring constant vigilance, constant deception, constant awareness that a single mistake might mean death or imprisonment. Relationships become impossible when you cannot tell your spouse what you do, where you go, what you have seen. Many turn to alcohol. Marriages collapse. Mental health deteriorates in silence because seeking help means admitting weakness, and weakness means suspicion. The agencies reward results but offer little support for those damaged. By the pursuit of those results, officers who serve for decades retire into isolation, unable to talk about their experiences, unable to process the things they have done, carrying secrets that will go with them to their graves. And always there is the knowledge that even success might be failure in disguise, that the defector you recruited might be a false flag, that the operation you ran might have been compromised from the beginning, that the intelligence you risked everything to obtain might be exactly what the enemy wanted you to find. By the late 1950s, both agencies have expanded far beyond their original mandates, operating across every continent, involving conflicts from Southeast Asia to Central America, from the Middle East to Sub-Saharan Africa. The scope of the shadow war grows beyond what any single person can comprehend. Operations multiply, networks expand, the number of people involved, officers, agents, informants, assets, reaches into the tens of thousands. And with that expansion comes fragmentation, a loss of central control, an increasing likelihood that something will go catastrophically wrong. Neither agency can fully track what all its officers are doing. Operations overlap, sometimes working at cross purposes. Intelligence becomes so voluminous that critical information is buried in noise. The fear of moles means that information is not shared even within agencies, creating islands of knowledge that never connect. The machinery that was built to provide clarity and control is becoming a source of confusion and risk, and somewhere in all this chaos, someone is making a mistake that neither agency will recognize until it is too late, a miscalculation that will push the world to the edge of annihilation. The mistake arrives not as a single catastrophic error, but as an accumulation of small miscalculations, each one defensible in isolation. Each one adding weight to a structure that no one realizes is about to collapse. Intelligence is always incomplete. Analysts work with fragments, intercepted communications, satellite photographs, reports from agents whose reliability is uncertain. From these pieces, they construct narratives, and those narratives guide decisions that affect millions of lives. But what happens when the narrative is wrong? What happens when the pressure to provide answers exceeds the quality of available information? By the early 1960s, both the CIA and KGB are operating in a fog of their own creation, drowning in data yet starving for certainty, and the leaders who depend on them are making decisions based on confidence that the intelligence communities themselves do not feel. Cuba becomes the crucible where all the tensions of the shadow war converge into a single point of unbearable pressure. When Fidel Castro's revolution succeeds in 1959, the CIA immediately begins planning his removal, convinced that a communist government 90 miles from Florida represents an intolerable threat. The Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961 is a disaster, poorly planned, inadequately supported, based on assumptions about Cuban popular support that prove completely false. The failure humiliates the Kennedy administration and convinces Castro that he needs Soviet protection. Nikita Khrushchev, seeing an opportunity to counterbalance American missiles in Turkey, decides to place nuclear weapons in Cuba. The decision is made in secret, the missiles shipped in cargo vessels, the sites constructed undercover. Soviet military doctrine holds that these weapons are defensive, meant to deter American aggression. But from Washington's perspective, nuclear missiles in Cuba fundamentally alter the strategic balance and cannot be tolerated. The stage is set for confrontation, but neither side fully understands what the other is thinking, what they will accept, what will push them past the point of restraint. American intelligence discovers the missile sites through U-2 reconnaissance flights in October 1962. The photographs are unambiguous: launching pads under construction, missiles being assembled. A threat that is immediate and undeniable. But what the photographs cannot show is intent. Are the Soviets planning a first strike, or are they creating a deterrent? Will they withdraw if confronted, or will they defend the installations militarily? The CIA's analysts provide estimates, but estimates are not certainty. Some believe the Soviets will back down. Others warn that confrontation could trigger war. President Kennedy assembles advisors, weighing options, and the discussions reveal how little anyone truly knows. Military leaders advocate for airstrikes to destroy the sites before they become operational. Diplomats urge negotiation. Intelligence officers present contradictory assessments, and through all of it runs the awareness that time is collapsing, that decisions must be made before the missiles are ready, that hesitation might mean accepting a permanent threat, but action might mean nuclear war. In Moscow, Khrushchev is receiving his own intelligence, and it is equally clouded by uncertainty. KGB reports suggest that an American invasion of Cuba is imminent. Soviet military advisors in Cuba send urgent cables describing American military buildups in Florida. Khrushchev does not want war, but he cannot appear weak, cannot abandon Cuba without guaranteeing that the Soviet Union's credibility as a defender of allied states will be destroyed. He orders Soviet forces in Cuba to prepare for combat, authorizes field commanders to use tactical nuclear weapons if an invasion begins. A decision that will not be revealed to the Americans, and that places the power to start a nuclear exchange in the hands of officers who may not have complete information about what is happening. The command structures on both sides are strained past their capacity. Messages take hours to transmit and decode. Orders are issued, then countermanded, then reissued. No one has a complete picture of what the other side is doing, and yet everyone is making decisions as if they do. Kennedy announces a naval blockade of Cuba, calling it a quarantine to avoid the legal implications of an act of war. Soviet ships carrying additional missiles are en route. The world watches, paralyzed, as the vessels approach the quarantine line. Will they stop? Will the American Navy fire on them if they do not? What will Moscow do if Soviet ships are attacked? Intelligence agencies on both sides scramble to assess intentions. CIA officers monitor Soviet communications, searching for any indication of what orders the ships have received. KGB officers in Washington watch for signs of American military mobilization that might indicate an imminent strike. The analysts are exhausted, working 20-hour shifts, knowing that their assessments might determine whether civilization survives. And through it all, they are aware of how much they do not know. Are there other Soviet submarines in the area? Are there additional missile sites that reconnaissance has not yet discovered? What are the actual capabilities of the weapons already in Cuba? Beneath the ocean, a Soviet submarine designated B-59 is running submerged, out of contact with Moscow. Its batteries nearly dead, its air supply depleting, its crew suffering an unbearable heat. American destroyers have detected the submarine and are dropping depth charges, not to destroy it, but to force it to surface, a common Cold War tactic. But the submarine's captain does not know this. He believes war has begun, that the depth charges are genuine attacks. The submarine is armed with a nuclear torpedo, and Soviet protocol allows its use if the vessel is under attack and cannot communicate with command. 3 officers must agree to launch it, to vote yes. The third, Vasily Arkhipov, refuses. The submarine surfaces. The moment passes. The world does not learn how close it came to nuclear war until decades later. Kennedy and Khrushchev, making decisions in Washington and Moscow, have no idea that the fate of their nations rested on a single Soviet officer's judgment. In a disabled submarine beneath the Caribbean, the crisis resolves through a combination of secret diplomacy and public compromise. Kennedy agrees to remove American missiles from Turkey, though this concession is not publicly announced to avoid the appearance of American weakness. Khrushchev orders the missiles in Cuba dismantled and returned to the Soviet Union, claiming victory in securing American promises not to invade Cuba. Both leaders present the outcome as a success, but within their intelligence agencies, the mood is far darker. The CIA and KGB both recognize how little control they actually had, how much of the crisis unfolded beyond their ability to monitor or influence, how many opportunities existed for miscommunication to trigger catastrophe. Field officers who lived through those 13 days describe a pervasive sense of dread, a certainty that they were witnessing the last days of the world. Analysts who provided intelligence to decision-makers carry the knowledge that their assessments were incomplete, that they were guessing as much as analyzing. That luck played as large a role as skill in avoiding disaster. The psychological toll on the intelligence communities is profound and largely invisible. Officers who spent the crisis on constant alert, monitoring communications, analyzing photographs, briefing leaders under impossible time pressure, emerged from the experience changed. Many develop a cynicism about the value of intelligence work, recognizing that even perfect information cannot eliminate uncertainty when human judgment and political pressure are involved. Some leave the agencies, unable to continue in roles where the stakes are so high and the margins for error so narrow. Others become more cautious, more reluctant to provide definitive assessments, a shift that will create its own problems as policymakers demand clarity that intelligence cannot honestly provide. The trust between intelligence agencies and political leaders frays. Kennedy and his advisors recognized that the CIA's confident predictions about the Bay of Pigs were disastrously wrong. Khrushchev learns that KGB assessments of American intentions were equally flawed. Both sides begin to view intelligence with greater skepticism, which paradoxically makes future crises more dangerous because leaders who do not trust their intelligence agencies are more likely to act on instinct or ideology rather than informed analysis. The machinery that brought the world to the edge of annihilation is not dismantled. The CIA and KGB continue their operations, continue recruiting agents, continue running covert actions, continue trying to outmaneuver each other across every continent. The nuclear arsenals grow larger, the surveillance capabilities more sophisticated, the networks of informants and sleeper agents more extensive. Both superpowers install hotlines to enable direct communication in future crises, an acknowledgement that the existing systems were inadequate. But a hotline cannot resolve the fundamental problem that intelligence is always incomplete, that intentions are always uncertain, that human beings under pressure make mistakes. The shadow war continues because neither side can afford to stop, because stopping means ceding advantage to the enemy, because the logic of competition has its own momentum that no single decision can halt. What the Cuban Missile Crisis reveals is not that the intelligence agencies failed, but that the entire system operates on assumptions that are fundamentally dangerous. The assumption that more information creates better decisions. The assumption that rational actors will always choose survival over ideology. The assumption that control is possible in a world where submarines lose contact with command, where field officers must make decisions that could start wars, where analysts work with fragments and must construct certainty from ambiguity. The world survives October 1962, but not because the system worked. It survives because individuals, Arkhipov and his submarine, Kennedy and Khrushchev and their willingness to seek compromise despite political pressure. Countless officers who chose restraint over escalation acted against the momentum of events. The shadow war continues, but those who fought in it during those 13 days understand something that the public never will. How fragile the peace is, how close the edge always remains. How little separates survival from annihilation, and that knowledge, that awareness of how nearly it all ended, changes nothing. The agencies return to their work. The operations continue. The world moves forward, saved by chance, carrying forward the mechanisms that brought it so close to destruction, waiting for the next crisis that luck might not resolve. The Cold War ends not with a climactic confrontation, but with exhaustion and collapse. When the Berlin Wall falls in 1989 and the Soviet Union dissolves 2 years later, Western intelligence agencies declare victory, convinced that their decades of pressure, their covert operations, their support for dissidents, and their economic warfare contributed to communism's defeat. But the officers who spent their careers in the shadow war understand that the reality is more complicated. The Soviet system collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions, economic stagnation, technological backwardness, the unsustainable cost of maintaining an empire, and an arms race simultaneously. Intelligence operations may have accelerated the decline, but they did not cause it. The KGB, despite its vast networks and its reputation for ruthless efficiency, could not save a system that had lost the faith of its own people. All the surveillance, all the informants, all the fear they instilled could not compensate for empty shells and broken promises. And in that failure lies an uncomfortable truth about intelligence work. It can destabilize, it can manipulate, it can win tactical victories, but it cannot make a fundamentally flawed system sustainable. The archives that opened after the Soviet collapse reveal the extent of both agencies' activities, and the revelations are sobering. The CIA's covert operations, documented in fragments through congressional investigations and leaked reports, show a pattern of interventions that achieve short-term objectives while creating long-term chaos. Governments toppled in the 1950s lead to instability that festers for decades. Leaders removed because they were seen as sympathetic to communism are replaced by dictators who brutalized their populations but remained friendly to American interests. The weapons and training provided to insurgents in one conflict become threats in the next. The KGB's files, partially accessible after 1991, reveal similar patterns. Successful penetrations of Western intelligence that provided valuable information, but also fed Soviet paranoia, encouraging purges and errors in judgment. The elaborate networks of informants in Eastern Europe that kept populations under control, but also poisoned societies with mistrust that persists long after the agencies themselves are gone. Both sides won battles and lost sight of whether the wars they were fighting served any purpose beyond their own continuation. What becomes clear in retrospect is that intelligence agencies develop institutional imperatives that transcend their original missions. The CIA and KGB were created to serve national interests, but over time they became entities with their own logic, their own definitions of success, their own reasons for existing, that had less to do with protecting their countries and more to do with perpetuating themselves. Operations generate the need for more operations. Networks must be maintained and expanded. Budgets must be justified through the discovery or creation of threats. Officers advance by producing results, which incentivizes risk-taking and the overselling of intelligence value. Both agencies became machines that consumed resources and lives and secrecy, growing ever larger and more complex, ever more difficult for political leaders to control or even understand. The question of whether these institutions made their nations more secure or merely more paranoid is one that neither country has fully confronted. The human cost of the shadow war is incalculable and mostly invisible. Agents betrayed and executed, their names unknown, their sacrifices unacknowledged. Officers who served for decades and retired into silence, unable to speak about what they did, carrying guilt or pride or emptiness with no outlet for processing any of it. Families destroyed by secrecy, by absences that could not be explained, by psychological damage that could not be treated because seeking help meant exposure. Populations in countries that became Cold War battlegrounds, their governments manipulated, their elections corrupted, their leaders assassinated or installed based on calculations made in distant capitals. The people who lived through Soviet occupation in Eastern Europe, their neighbors turned into informants, their private conversations reported to the state, their trust in human relationships corroded beyond repair. The civilians killed in proxy wars from Korea to Angola to Afghanistan, conflicts that were fed and prolonged by superpower rivalry and intelligence agency maneuvering. None of these costs appear in the triumphalist narratives that followed the Cold War's end. The victories are remembered, the prices are forgotten. The doctrine that emerges from the Cold War becomes the foundation for modern intelligence work. Surveillance technologies developed to monitor Soviet communications evolve into systems that can track virtually anyone, anywhere. The psychological warfare techniques refined during decades of ideological competition are adapted for the digital age. The understanding that information can be weaponized, that public opinion can be shaped through carefully planted stories and strategic leaks, that elections can be influenced without ever casting a fraudulent vote. These insights do not disappear with the Soviet Union's collapse. They are studied, refined, and applied in new contexts. The KGB's successor agencies in Russia continue operating with the same fundamental approach, adapted to post-Soviet realities. The assumptions that justified covert action during the Cold War, that American interests are best served by shaping foreign governments, that stability is less important than alignment, that the ends justify the means persist into the 21st century with predictable results. The realization that settles over both the intelligence communities and their observers is that the shadow war never truly ended. It transformed. The ideological struggle between capitalism and communism gave way to different conflicts, but the tools and tactics developed during the Cold War remain in constant use. Cyber operations replace dead drops and invisible ink, but the objective is the same: to obtain information, to deceive adversaries, to gain advantage without open confrontation. Social media becomes the new battleground for influence operations, more effective than Radio Free Europe ever was, because the targets voluntarily consumed the content share. It defended, never quite certain whether what they are reading is genuine grassroots sentiment or state-sponsored manipulation. The line between intelligence gathering and mass surveillance dissolves, as technology makes it possible to collect data on entire populations, to analyze patterns of behavior, to predict, and potentially influence human decisions on scales that Cold War agencies could barely imagine. The legal and ethical frameworks struggle to keep pace, and in the gap between what technology enables and what law permits, intelligence agencies operate with the same assumption that guided them during the Cold War. That security justifies secrecy, that the public cannot be trusted with full knowledge of what is done in their name. The uncomfortable question that haunts both sides is whether any of it was worth the cost. Did the CIA's operations make America safer? Or did they create enemies and instability that persist into the present? Did the KGB surveillance state preserve Soviet power? Or did it accelerate the system's moral and economic bankruptcy? The officers who carried out these operations, the ones still alive, offer no consensus. Some remain convinced that they served a necessary purpose, that the alternative to intelligence work was ignorance and vulnerability, that the sacrifices were justified by the stakes. Others express doubt, wondering whether different choices might have produced better outcomes, whether the reflexive secrecy and the constant competition created problems that diplomacy and transparency might have avoided. The historical record offers no clear answer because the counterfactuals cannot be tested. We know what happened. We can only speculate about what might have been. What is certain is that the institutions and practices born during the Cold War are now permanent features of the modern world. Intelligence agencies in dozens of countries operate with mandates and capabilities that would have seemed like science fiction in 1947. The amount of information collected, stored, and analyzed every day exceeds what the CIA and KGB accumulated in decades of Cold War competition. The technical sophistication of surveillance and cyber operations has advanced beyond what most citizens understand or could meaningfully consent to, even if asked. And the assumption that guides all of it, that more information creates more security, that knowing everything about potential adversaries prevents threats, that secrecy is necessary and oversight is dangerous, remains largely unchallenged despite decades of evidence suggesting that intelligence failures are as common as intelligence successes that excessive secrecy breeds. corruption and error, that the threats intelligence agencies warn about are sometimes threats they helped create. The shadow war between the CIA and KGB shaped the second half of the 20th century. But its legacy extends far beyond that period. The methods they pioneered, the networks they built, the precedents they established, the cultures of secrecy they normalized, all of this continues to influence how nations interact, how conflicts are fought, how information is controlled and weaponized. We live in a world where the tools of intelligence are more powerful than ever, where the capacity to monitor, analyze, and influence human behavior has reached levels that would have astounded Cold War spy masters, where the boundary between intelligence gathering and social control has become increasingly unclear, and we live with the consequences of decisions made decades ago by people operating in shadows, pursuing objectives we are only now beginning to fully understand, creating systems that no one is entirely sure how to dismantle or reform, even if there were the will to do so. The most dangerous wars are the ones never officially declared, fought by people whose names we do not know, for reasons that are never fully explained, producing outcomes that shape our world in ways we barely recognize. The Cold War ended, but the Shadow War continues, quieter now, more sophisticated, more integrated into the fabric of modern life. And the question that remains, the one each generation must answer for itself, is whether the security these agencies promise is worth the freedom and transparency they require us to surrender, whether the world they help create is the one we want to inhabit, whether we even have the information necessary to make the judgment, or whether that remains hidden, classified, locked away in archives we will never access, known only to the guardians of secrets who insist that some truths are too dangerous for democracy to bear. If this story left you questioning what else remains hidden in the shadows of history, subscribe for more deep investigations into the intelligence operations that shape our world. And in the comments below, tell us, did anyone truly win the Cold War? Or did both sides lose something irretrievable in the darkness? The answer might matter more than you think.